What happened to the family of Cain? Instead of a great start, his life and descendants would be filled with tragedy, curses, and murder. Most people are taken back when they learn that the Bible contains several examples of curses. After the fall of man, Adam, Eve, and the snake were put under a curse. Then Eve gave birth to her sons. Genesis 4:1, New King James Version. Now Adam knew Eve his wife, and she convinced and bore Cain and said, I have acquired a man from the Lord. Adam knew Eve his wife in the sense that he had intimate relations with her. When Cain was born, she acknowledged that his birth was only by the Lord's enablement. In naming him Cain, acquisition, Eve may have thought she had given birth to the promised seed. Eve most likely believed that Cain was the seed God had promised, the deliverer who would come from Eve after God cursed the serpent. Eve may have believed that she was holding in her arms the Messiah, the one who would save the entire world. But in reality, she was holding a murderer in her arms. Abel brought an offering of blood, the firstborn of his flock, and Cain brought an offering of vegetation, the fruit of the ground. Genesis 4:6-9, New King James Version. So the Lord said to Cain, Why are you angry, and why has your countenance fallen? If you do well, will you not be accepted? And if you do not do well, sin lies at the door. And its desire is for you, but you should rule over it. Now Cain talked with Abel his brother, and it came to pass when they were in the field, that Cain rose up against Abel his brother and killed him. Then the Lord said to Cain, Where is Abel your brother? He said, I do not know. Am I my brother's keeper? God says, Where is Abel your brother? God knew the answer to this question, and he asked Cain because he wanted to allow him to confess his sin and start to do right after doing wrong. Cain's attempt to deceive God was completely fruitless. It was absolute lunacy on his part to believe that God was unaware of Abel's whereabouts, or that he could conceal his sin from God in any way. Cain says, Am I my brother's keeper? This reply of Cain is famous. The fact is that he was supposed to be his brother's keeper, but instead he was his brother's murderer, and he murdered him for the most base of reasons. He slayed his brother because he was jealous of his brother's success. Cain had suffered no harm at all at the hands of Abel. Cain's murderous rage was inspired purely by spiritual jealousy. Jude 11 warns of the way of Cain, which is unbelief, empty religion leading to jealousy, persecution of those truly godly, and murderous anger. God's curse upon Cain. Genesis 4:10-12, New King James Version. And he said, What have you done? The voice of your brother's blood cries out to me from the ground. So now you are cursed from the earth, which has opened its mouth to receive your brother's blood from your hand. When you till the ground, it shall no longer yield its strength to you. A fugitive and a vagabond you shall be on the earth. Cain's evil attitude of jealous rage was soon translated into hostile action, the murder of his brother. Though Abel is dead, he still tells us that the life of faith is the life that counts. Hebrews 11:4. By faith Abel offered to God a more excellent sacrifice than Cain, through which he obtained witness that he was righteous, God testifying of his gifts, and through it, being dead, still speaks. When an unrepentant, insolent reply met the Lord's loving question, he pronounced Cain's judgment. He would no longer be able to make a living from the soil, but would wander as a fugitive in the desert. The blood of Abel spoke, and it spoke of judgment. The blood of Jesus speaks, but of better things, of grace and of sin having been judged. Hebrews 12:24. To the Bible, once again, we must look for a correct understanding of these laws. In Proverbs 26:2, Solomon establishes this principle concerning curses. A curse without cause shall not alight. Behind every curse there is a cause. Proverbs 26:2. Like the sparrow in her wandering, like the swallow in her flying, so the curse without cause does not come and alight on the undeserving. Genesis 4:13-15, New King James Version. And Cain said to the Lord, "My punishment is greater than I can bear. Surely you have driven me out this day from the face of the ground. I shall be hidden from your face. I shall be a fugitive and a vagabond on the earth, and it will happen that anyone who finds me will kill me." And the Lord said to him, "Therefore whoever kills Cain, vengeance shall be taken on him sevenfold." And the Lord set a mark on Cain, lest anyone finding him should kill him. Cain's whimpering complaint reveals remorse for the consequences of his sin, rather than for its guilt. But even then the Lord allayed the fugitive's fear for his life by putting a protective mark on Cain, and a curse on anyone who killed him. Cain went out from the presence of the Lord, the saddest of all departures. As a result, God branded Cain with a sign that would identify him and serve as a safeguard. Nobody knows what this mark on Cain was, even though various people have speculated about it. The nature of the mark on Cain has been the subject of much debate and speculation. The Hebrew word translated mark is oath and refers to a mark, sign, or token. Elsewhere in the Hebrew scriptures, oath is used 79 times and is most frequently translated as sign. So the Hebrew word does not identify the exact nature of God's mark on Cain. Whatever it was a sign or indicator that Cain was not to be killed. Some people believe the mark was a scar or a tattoo on the individual's body. In any event, the specific nature of the mark is not the primary focus of the passage. The focus is that God would not allow people to exact revenge against Cain. Whatever the mark on Cain was, it served this purpose. The suffering of Cain, the firstborn son, is a pattern that repeats itself, starting from his father Adam to Esau and Ishmael. Cain moves away and marries. Genesis 4:16-17, New King James Version. Then Cain went out from the presence of the Lord and dwelt in the land of Nod on the east of Eden. And Cain knew his wife, and she conceived and bore Enoch. And he built a city, and called the name of the city after the name of his son, Enoch. Cain married his sister or other blood relatives. As mentioned, Genesis 4:3 allows time for a population increase, and Genesis 5:4 states explicitly that Adam had sons and daughters. Marriage of close relatives was not outlawed then, nor was it genetically risky. And Cain knew his wife. Adam had other sons and daughters, according to Genesis 5:4. It is evident that Cain married his sister, even though it's forbidden to marry a sister according to Leviticus 18:9 and Deuteronomy 27:22. This was long before God spoke that law to Moses, and to the world at large, which even prohibits the marriage of a half-sister. Here, necessity demanded that Adam's sons marry his daughters. We read, "And he built a city." The beginning of industry and urbanization can be seen here. Man-centered from the start, the city was named after his son's name, not God-centered. The fall of the human race continued and even increased. The generations following Cain. Genesis 4:18-22. To Enoch was born Irad, and Irad begot Mehujael, and Mehujael begot Methusael, and Methusael begot Lamech. Then Lamech took for himself 2 wives, The name of one was Ada, and the name of the second was Zillah, and Ada bore Jabal. He was the father of those who dwell in tents and have livestock. His brother's name was Jubal. He was the father of all those who play the harp and flute. And as for Zillah, she bore Tubal-Cain, an instructor of every craftsman in bronze and iron, and the sister of Tubal-Cain was Naamah. It is possible that Lamech means conqueror in Hebrew. According to Cain's genealogy, he was the sixth child from Adam. Lamech's arrogance is a contrast to the godliness of Enoch, who was the sixth from Adam in Seth's line. The names of his wives and daughters also show the emphasis in his heart. Ada means pleasure, ornament, or beauty. Zillah means shade, probably referring to a luxurious covering of hair. His daughter's name was Naamah, which means loveliness. Lamech's culture was committed to physical and outward beauty. Lamech's arrogant boast. Genesis 4:23-24. Lamech said to his wives, Ada and Zillah, hear my voice. You wives of Lamech, listen to what I say, for I have killed a man merely for wounding me, and a boy only for striking, bruising me. If Cain is avenged sevenfold, as the Lord said he would be, then Lamech will be avenged 77-fold. Lamech boasted about his murder of another, and the way he believed he could promise more significant retribution than God demonstrates a gradual degeneration among humankind. The human race experienced rapid deterioration, which can be described as devolution. We read, If Cain shall be avenged sevenfold, then Lamech 77-fold. This is all a representation of a man-centered perspective. The city was Cain's city. The focus of Lamech was his beautiful wives and perceived strength. But for all of Lamech's boasting, neither he nor his descendants are ever heard of again in the Bible. He came to nothing. Sometimes curses may come from previous generations. Does that mean there is no hope? Does the human race continue like this? No, there is hope. As we move on, we discover that God has provided a remedy. The most notable member of Cain's descendants is the boastful Lamech. The 21 words of his speech constitute what is often considered an example of earliest poetry. Since the beginning of various aspects of civilization is highlighted in this section, the exchange of blows perhaps denotes the start of war among humans. Interestingly, with all of the beginnings cited in this passage, there is no origin of kingship. This is of special interest since, in the records from the ancient Near East, kingship was one of the most significant developments within civilization. City building, multiple wives, and initiation of warfare are three elements most consistently associated with kings in ancient literature. In Genesis 4, Lamech is most closely associated with typical actions linked with kingship. The text moves from unrepentant Cain to defiant Lamech. Violence is glorified, and the mark of Cain no longer stands as a stigma of exile, but as a badge of honor that offers protection equal to invulnerability. Verses 17-24 list Cain's posterity and a series of firsts. The first city, named Enoch. The first case of polygamy. The beginning of organized animal husbandry. The beginning of the art of music and of metal crafts. The first song concerning violence and bloodshed. In the song, Lamech explains to his wives that he killed a young man in self-defense, but that because it wasn't premeditated, like Cain's murder of his brother, Lamech would be much more immune from reprisal. By this speech of Lamech, recorded here and probably much talked of in those times, he seemed to have been a wicked man. First, observe how haughtily he talks to his wives, as one that expected mighty regard and observance. Hear my voice, you wives of Lamech. Second, how bloody and brutal he was to all about him. I have slain, or I would slay a man in my wound, and a young man in my hurt. He owns himself a man of a fierce spirit. As the family of Cain perpetuated more rebellion against God, the line of Cain built the city of man. This project reached a climax later with the building of the Tower of Babel. Both then and now, men without God are driven towards building great empires in defiance of God. They typically consolidate power to establish a government that is empty of Christ's rule. Since Cain built his first city, this has been the passion of the men who run from God. Consider also the further rebellion of Lamech, Cain's great-great-great-grandson. Over a century after God's declaration against Cain, Lamech continues to mock and twist God's word. How does this passage teach us to walk with God in faith and obedience? The life of the vagabond, the wanderer, and the stranger is cursed. It is a life empty of long-term relationships, accountability, and an authentic community. It is very much the picture of life in the modern city. As men build their cities and roam from community to community, they gradually give up on maintaining close relationships and accountability. A heart that constantly seeks to stray from relationships with God and with brothers and sisters is not one we should desire. They become increasingly comfortable in their world of anonymity. Instead, let us strive to have good relationships with our family and churches. This is all we know about the family and posterity of cursed Cain until we find them all wiped out in the universal flood. Genesis 4:25-26. Adam knew Eve as his wife again, and she gave birth to a son and named him Seth, for she said, God has granted another child for me in place of Abel, because Cain killed him. To Seth also a son was born, whom he named Enosh, mortal man, mankind. At that same time, men began to call on the name of the Lord, in worship through prayer, praise, and thanksgiving. After this terrible story of disobedience in Cain's line, the chapter ends with a light of hope. In contrast to Cain's line, God selected a new family tree. God gave Eve a son named Seth in place of Abel. Seth illustrated the same type of worship as his deceased brother Abel, as people started to invoke the Lord's name in connection with Seth. Prideful worship, as practiced by Cain, points to himself. Humble worship, as practiced by Abel and Seth, calls out to God. Jude 11. Woe to them, for they have gone the defiant way of Cain, and for profit they have run headlong into the error of Balaam, and perished in the rebellion of mutinous Korah. It is no surprise that when God needed an obedient servant hundreds of years later, he chose Noah from Seth's line.